Hi, sixth graders. So now that you've had a chance to look at or watch a video to learn a little bit more about ice cores, now it's time to get to the data. Like we said, we've got to gather data to know if Emily is right about why climate is changing or if Destiny is right about why climate is changing. And as good scientists, we're going to rely on data to help us figure that out. To do that, you're going to look at three different graphs. Those graphs are data. They're measurements of the climate and the atmosphere. And you can get data from analyzing or figuring out what those graphs are telling you. Like I said, there's three graphs you're going to look at. I'm going to model for you how to analyze the first graph, and then you're going to follow that model and analyze the following two graphs. So let's go ahead and get started. What you see on the screen right now is the first graph that we are going to look at. I'm going to ask you a series of 4 questions. I want you to discuss those questions and pause the video so you can talk about them as a team, and then I'll kind of give you my thoughts about them as well. So here's our first question I want you to discuss. What type of information can you learn from this graph? So take a look at the graph, look at all the things it's telling you, and then pause the video and discuss this question as a team. All right, now that you've had a chance to discuss, here's what I learned from this graph. First, I always look at the title, Climate Readings to the Present. So what that tells me is I'm going to look at some measurements on this graph that have to do with the climate. And since it says to the present, that tells me I'm looking at measurements of the climate from the past that lead up to today or to the present. So I know I'm looking at measurements of climate from the past up to today. And when I look at the lines on the graph, I see there's actually 2 lines on this graph. It's a little different from most graphs that I see, but that's okay. You can have this. Each line seems to represent a different thing. I see there's a blue line, and it's labeled with CO2. So I'm guessing that this line tells me something about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The red line I see is labeled with temp or temperature. So I'm guessing this has something to do with the temperature of the Earth, which kind of makes sense since I know when you talk about climate, you talk a lot about temperature, you hear a lot about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it kind of makes sense to me that if I'm looking at a graph about climate, I'm going to see information about carbon dioxide and about temperature. Okay, so second question. What are the units on each axis of the graph? So remember, the axes are the lines on the bottom and on the sides. So look at the information on the bottom and the sides of the graph and discuss what units you see and what that tells you. Okay, so now that you've discussed that as a team, here's what I see for the units. First off, on the bottom, the label says thousands of years before present. Well, I know present means today, and so 0 years before today is today. So this 0 right here must represent today. The other numbers then must tell me how many thousands of years before the present these measurements come from. So the measurements above this number are from 100,000 years ago. The measurements above this number here are from 250,000 years ago, and so on, all the way back to measurements that must come from 400,000 years ago. Okay, so I can see these measurements are really, really old, up to over 400,000 years old. On the left side, anyway, that was the x-axis I was looking at. Now I'm going to look at one of the y-axis. I see this kind of reddish area. My guess is since this y-axis is red, it probably has to do with this red line on the graph. And this is labeled temperature change degrees Celsius. Okay, so that clearly tells me that the red line's measuring temperature, and it tells me how much the temperature has changed in degrees Celsius, which I know is one way of measuring temperature. But I've also got a blue line, so let's see what the blue line's being measured in. Carbon dioxide, and I can see here, okay, carbon dioxide on the right, ppmv, and I just know because I've learned this before that ppmv stands for parts per million volume. It's not really important you know what that means right now. All you really have to know is that as the numbers get bigger, that means that there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if the line's going up, that means the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. If the line's going down, the amount of carbon dioxide is decreasing. So that's how I can use the axes to help me figure out what this graph is telling me. The next question to discuss. When did scientists start gathering this data? And when was the most recent measurement? So look at the graph and then pause the video and discuss that with your team. Now that you've discussed that, let me tell you what I can tell from this graph. First off, when did scientists start gathering this data? Well, again, on the bottom, on the x-axis, I know that we have time down here, thousands of years before present. So if I want to know when the first measurement was taken, I have to go all the way to left here, to the oldest measurement, which is to the left of 400,000 years ago. So I'm going to say it's about 420,000 years. That's when scientists started these measurements. Now, I know that scientists weren't around 420,000 years ago measuring these things, but I remember from learning about the ice cores that we can get stuff from 420,000 years ago from the ice cores. So connecting this to what I know about ice cores, I'm guessing that the measurements for this graph come from that ice core data that I learned about before. So I know the first measurements come from 420,000 years ago. The next question, though, is when was the most recent measurement? Well, it wasn't 0. That's not the present day. It's not a year for when it is now. So I'm going to have to look somewhere else on this graph to know what year the most recent measurements were taken. And I see down here in the bottom right, there's some information about who made this graph and where they got the information from. And I see the data, which are the numbers they used to make the graph, come from the year 2001. So I can probably guess that the most recent measurement on the far right of the graph here comes from the year 2001. Okay. So now I got a sense of what years this data covers. Now here's the last question that I want you to discuss. It's the most important one. What patterns do you notice in the graph? Now when you're looking at a graph, patterns can mean a lot of things. It can mean, do you see things that are repeated over and over again in the graph? Because we have two different lines here, do you see any connections between what's happening in the two graphs? It could also mean, like, do you notice anything strange happening in one or both of the graphs that's different from the other parts of the graph? So think about all those things, then pause the video and discuss with your team. Okay, now that you've had a chance to discuss the patterns you notice, let me tell you about the patterns that I notice in this graph. First off, let's look at temperature. I noticed that temperatures 420,000 years ago started kind of warmer, and then they decreased, things cooled off, and then they got warm again, and then they cooled off, and warm again and cooled off. And so I see that in the last 420,000 years, there's a pattern of the Earth warming up and then cooling down, and then warming up and then cooling down, then warming up over and over and over again. So that's one pattern that I notice. Another pattern, now let's look at the carbon dioxide line. I notice a similar pattern for carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide levels decrease, then increase, then decrease, then increase, then decrease, then increase. So again, there seems to be a pattern there of carbon dioxide levels going up and then coming down and then going up and coming down over time. So that's one pattern, or actually that's two patterns I see. But now, here's a really interesting connection I noticed between these two lines. Remember how I said that I see both lines, both temperature and carbon dioxide, increasing and decreasing in the past? What I notice in this graph is that that seems to happen at the exact same time. The same time that the temperature is increasing, the carbon dioxide levels are also going up. It happens here, it happens here, 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 and then even here towards the present. I also notice that when the carbon dioxide levels go down, the temperature also goes down. So there seems to be some connection between levels of carbon dioxide and temperature on Earth. And that makes sense to me because I learned in the previous task when we did the climate in the bottle experiment that when we put more carbon dioxide into a closed system like the Earth's atmosphere, that carbon dioxide is going to trap energy and warm up the temperature. So what I see happening in the graph fits with what I know about how carbon dioxide works, so that makes a lot of sense. Last thing I notice, and this is really important, there's a big jump in the carbon dioxide levels at the very end of this graph at present day, way higher than the carbon dioxide levels anywhere else on this line. So that tells me something really big has happened in the recent present. And I don't know what it is from this graph yet, but I definitely know that the carbon dioxide is way higher than it's ever been in the past. So that's how I've analyzed this graph. Now I want you and your team to analyze the next two graphs.